Thank you for watching. I'm Jim Falk, and let me welcome my co-host, Dennis McCuistion.
We taped part one of this just a week or so before we taped this program. We hope that you watched it, but in the event that you didn't, let me tell you that we're talking about starting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in the wake of the 9/11 2001 situation, which was just a few weeks ago, the 20th anniversary of that. And so I'm going to ask Jim to introduce our excellent guests, and then they'll bring us up to date on what we covered in part one, and then what we're going to talk about in part two.
And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome our guest today. First, Jeffrey Engel. Professor Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He is the author and editor of 13 books on American foreign policy and the U.S. presidency. And one of his books, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the Cold War, is frankly one of the best books I've ever read on that epochal time in history. He's also the co-author of The Last Card, Inside George W. Bush's Decision to Surge in Iraq. He's joined by journalist author Robert Draper. Draper is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine and also a contributing writer for National Geographic. He's the author as well of several books. We're going to be focusing today on two: Dead Certain, The Presidency of George W. Bush, in his most recent book, To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq. Great to have both of you with us. And Robert, if I may, I'd like to start with you. You're a journalist. I'm going to put you on the spot. Just give a quick summary of what we covered in our last program.
Sure, Jim. What we did was talk about these two wars that emanated from the attacks on America on September the 11th, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. We spoke about the legacies of these wars, how we got into them to begin with, how they shape-shifted, how they've affected our foreign policy since then. We talked as well about the legal implications of these wars and the war powers that were bestowed on the president in the wake of September 11th and what that means for future administrations.
I'll go on and pick on you one more time. The journalism and the media really didn't fare that well leading up into the Iraq War. In particular, some of the top reporters then at the New York Times, Judith Miller, Michael Gordon, and others, were later criticized for their coverage. How does the media look back at that?
Well, I know how they should look back at it. They should look back at it, with a certain amount of penitence. It was a failure, just as there were intelligence failures and decision-making failures. Not everybody in the media got it wrong, but I do think that there was a rather surprising number across the ideological spectrum of journalists who, for one reason or another, either gave the administration the benefit of the doubt, were too consumed with having the next scoop, and the next scoop would have presumably been finding the weapons of mass destruction somewhere, or who had also relied on their own experiences with covering Iraq in the past. There were many journalists who'd seen what Saddam Hussein had done to his own countrymen, and they extrapolated from that something that I think was understandable but really unfortunate, which is that a man who would do such things to the Kurds and to the Shia might also do such things to the world at large. That is a massive intuitive leap, and it's one that many journalists took because they thought that Saddam's evil was boundless.
Well, that's a good point that you make there. And the other thing in trying now to get through this, how the Iraq decision was made, you talked in the previous program about Paul Wolfowitz. You talked about Douglas Feith, I think. You also talked about, of course, Vice President Cheney. You make a differentiation in your book about who are neocons and who are not. So for that person watching, first of all, tell us what a neocon is. Secondly, which two of those folks might be considered neocons, and whether or not a neocon perspective was, along with Mr. Ahmad Chalabi, by the way, was instrumental in actually taking the action against Iraq in the first place.
Sure, Dennis, I'll try to do this as briefly as I can. I actually avoided using that term neoconservative in the book. I think I used it a grand total of 1 time. And the reason is because it's become such a baggy term that means different things to different people. In fact, there were very different motivations between those that were harbored by, say, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and Vice President Dick Cheney. Wolfowitz was an idealist, and he believed very much in nation building. He believed in democratization, and that is a kind of classic neoconservative point of view, where Vice President Cheney was not animated by democratization. He was animated instead by the need to project force. He believed that other countries didn't take us seriously anymore. That when we said we were going to retaliate after an attack had taken place against our interests, that we would never make good on that, and they would absorb that, and they would know that we were not, not worth our bluffs. Cheney wanted to end all of that, and so his, in a lot of ways, was a kind of a classic hawkishness. Wolfowitz, I think, had in the end more in common with the president of the United States, or rather the other way around, I should say, that Bush was driven by a need to project force for sure, but he was very, very quick to believe that this could be a great opportunity for America. It would be a great opportunity for us to form new alliances, and for us to, I think, remake the kind of ideological map of the United States, which, as Jeffrey has, of the Middle East, which, as Jeffrey has correctly pointed out, it did in the earlier episode when we were talking about all of this. This was not what George W. Bush intended to do when he came into office. He intended to be a domestic president. He had in fact, he said in a presidential debate, if we're humble, they'll respect us, referring to the outside world. That he had a very, very different perspective after September 11th.
Professor Engel, you have researched this so carefully and talked to so many people. And I'm looking at this quote here, and it touches on what Robert just said, that President Bush had this almost evangelical belief in democracy. And he was with King Abdullah of Jordan, and he said, "We will affect how the world looks tomorrow. History has called on us." And yet he was warned by so many people that this was not going to be the right way to direct our foreign policy. And yet he refused to back down.
He was warned even by people within his own administration who realized that the declaration that the United States would essentially assault what he determined to be evil or tyranny throughout the world to promote freedom throughout the world, as he most explicitly said in his 2005 second inaugural address, was frankly a big heavy lift. That it was quite difficult. And I've always been of the belief that President Bush believed in his heart in the notion of freedom, especially freedom as a gift from the Creator, and frankly never thought it was necessary to define exactly what freedom was, or frankly even to recognize that freedom could mean different things to different people. Essentially, he believed it so deeply in his core that if one did not understand that freedom was a gift, you probably were never going to. And when we place this in the long context of American history, I think the best way that I found to understand this is that Bush doesn't think differently about freedom and about democracy than most other presidents. Most presidents believe freedom is good, believe democracy is good, whatever term you want to have for free markets or capitalism or the Western way, whatever term you want to use. They believe the United States is on the vanguard of what is right and proper, and that the world would look better and be better if it looked more like us. The difference with Bush, both because of his innate beliefs and also I think catalyzed by fear after 9/11, was that Bush, unlike other presidents, was not willing to wait for it to happen, was not willing to let the rest of the world essentially come to appreciate what we already do, that our form of democracy was best. Rather, he wanted to catalyze it, that we could no longer wait, that history was at a moment where we needed to move and had the power to move. So rather than wait for, let's say, a generation or more for the democratic revolutions that had animated Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, rather than wait for that to essentially permeate throughout the Middle East over the ensuing years after 9/11, Bush thought we could put this on steroids and essentially could accomplish that goal with force. So essentially wanting to make the world look like America, but not willing to wait too long to make it happen.
And in particular, not always listening to others. And Robert, I'm very interested in the writing of your book, how many people you interviewed, and in many cases it was 10, a decade back. Did you find a different level of candor and frankness, say, between middle level people and those who were at the top levels of power?
Yes, I did, and I think that this is kind of this is axiomatic of interviewing people for any journalistic inquiry, that it's always nice to have the marquee names, and I did, in fact, interview a number of very important people, a lot of the central players in the whole Iraq episode, but that they also have legacies to protect, defend, burnish, and I found instead that it's the people in the middle tiers who were close to the action, who were observers of the action, but whose names are not household names and don't feel like that they have to in any way promote or defend themselves, who are the most helpful. And I would in particular say that of the 350 or so individuals that I interviewed for this book, about 70 or 80 were from the CIA. And they were all people who had retired, in some cases just a matter of weeks before I reached out to them, but who were all there during the Iraq saga. And so they had an incredible, acute catbird seat into intelligence briefings with the president, with the vice president, with Wolfowitz, and they knew better than so many others about just what was flawed about the intelligence. I do want to say one thing about the intel, though. It's widely understood that we got everything wrong on the intelligence, and that the CIA and the intelligence community got it wrong. It's certainly true that if you grabbed almost everyone, not everyone, but almost anyone from the IC and asked them, do you think Saddam has weapons? Nearly all of them would say, yes, I do think that he does. They would caveat it. They would say, I think, I don't know. The information we have is old, but if you're asking me to rely on my gut, I think so. But if you ask them the second question, but do you think Saddam poses a threat to the US? Uniformly, they would say, no, he does not. That would be a suicide mission for him to go after the United States. And Saddam himself had offered himself up as a potential ally after 9/11. And yet that was the key sort of intelligence imaginative leap, I should say, that the Bush administration took, that this man was uniquely a threat to America and intended to make good on that threat when there was no evidence whatsoever to support that assertion.
Jeffrey, when I read some of the materials that have come out about this, I get the sense that, frankly, the Department of State was outplayed. They were left behind. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is a fair assessment. And I think it also speaks to the broader issue, frankly, of why I think the war occurred. As Robert has demonstrated brilliantly, it's the best book out there on the subject. The Bush administration thought about this plan, and really there were no naysayers throughout the plan of invading Iraq, at least in the presidency year, for the first several years after 9/11. And I think one of the reasons for that is that even those people within the intelligence community or within the State Department who thought that this was a bad idea, who thought it wasn't necessary perhaps to invade Iraq, even if Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction, they still all thought that we were going to win. They still all thought that the United States military was so dominant that there was simply no task we could give it that they couldn't accomplish. So when we ask why the State Department or other elements of the government were not utilized as much, is because Americans, frankly, had gotten quite used to reaching for the military lever whenever there was a problem to be solved, military hammer, if you will, to neglect of all other tools. And to their broader point, they expected that tool to work. The Americans had told themselves that their troops were the best and brightest, that their officer corps were well trained, and that the officer corps' mission was essentially, when ordered by the president, to say yes sir and to go off and do it. There's nowhere in that scenario, there's nowhere within that logical sequence that suggests that they're going to not make it or to fail. In fact, it's almost somewhat disrespectful at this point to suggest that American troops could ever fail. Yet I think the universal view, the opposite, was what led to the war.
You know what that reminds me of? What the British probably thought in 1776, but they didn't realize that people over here might fight differently. Seems like the people over there, the so-called terrorists, freedom fighters known to some, had different tactics maybe than our military. And I've heard that our military tried to train the Afghan troops in the way that our people were trained. I don't know that worked. So, but Jeffrey, let me take you back and give it a little bit perspective. Let me take you back to Bill Clinton's presidency. He had, by some counts, and one of our guests on the program a few years ago, 11 different opportunities to get Osama bin Laden, and he did not do so. And that's what led then, obviously, to 9/11. So take us back to that presidency just briefly, but then hit on how President Obama and President Trump, who neither of which had any foreign policy experience, and then of course President Biden, who allegedly does, give us some sense of those people's actions in the light of your study of presidential power.
Well, you know, it's a great question, because let's unpack for a minute what it means when we say that President Clinton had the opportunity to get Osama bin Laden. Remember, in the period after of his presidency, in the period after the Cold War, there's a lot of consternation over what the world is going to look like. And as I said before, Americans tend to reach for a military hammer, but that isn't necessarily the hammer that the rest of the world wants. And so when we say that that President Clinton had the chance to get Osama bin Laden, what we're largely talking about there is, had the opportunity, Clinton was asked, do you want to destroy another part of a sovereign country elsewhere in the world and kill people around the world? Even if you think it's the right thing, the rest of the world might does view terrorism less as a military problem than as a criminal problem, and that we should do more to try to eliminate the problem, not just blow it up in other parts of the world, because that's only going to cause it to metastasize and to grow in other places. So in the broad sense, I think American policymakers like Clinton, like Bush, like Obama, like Joe Biden, all believe that American military force can solve more problems, I think, than it can. In fact, I think even if we look at what President Biden suggested when he was vice president, when President Obama was given the opportunity or the question of whether or not he should himself surge troops in Afghanistan, which of course he said yes, I think largely for domestic political reasons. I think President Biden was quite obviously on record saying we should pull out with the exception of military force. Let's keep a token force there. Let's keep the opportunity and reserve the right to ourselves, if you will, to destroy any enemy that we see coming over the horizon with military force. But remember, that means violating another country's sovereignty. That means essentially doing an act of war, one could interpret, on other countries. That should not be done as easily and as quickly as I think Americans have come to expect the president to do.
Robert, I don't want you to go without asking this question that you did quite a bit of research and wrote about, and that is what I think has to be probably the worst decision in the whole conflict, and that was Paul Bremmer's decision to de-Ba'athify the country, to essentially send all the military home with their guns and no paycheck. How was a decision like that made when it was clear that many people in the Department of State and military thought this is really dumb?
So to be fair to Bremmer, I mean, and Bremmer has consistently defended those decisions, but they actually weren't of his authorship. They were designed by the Undersecretary for Policy, Doug Feith, in concert with a couple of conservative think tank guys and Ahmed Chalabi. I mean, Chalabi very much wanted to see a deep de-Ba'athification because he wanted essentially to start from scratch and to assume loyalty tests for the new government, and so that process was very much controlled, and I think very unwisely delegated to Chalabi. The disbanding of the army is in a lot of ways the worst decision, and because that was on its face taking an army that, okay, had gone to ground, was not standing in a battle formation ready for someone to talk to them, but essentially taking their paychecks away from them, but not their guns. So now you had a bunch of angry Iraqis who had been promised, they had truly been promised in leaflets that were dropped from the sky by coalition forces, go home to your families, and we will stay in peace, and we will talk to you at some point about participating in the new government. Instead, they became disbanded, and they became quite angry, and they formed the basis of the insurgency. It was a truly disastrous move. Bremmer would defend it by saying that, well, there wasn't any army to stand up, and that's just baloney. There wasn't an army to disband, rather, that our intelligence officials actually had hard drives that were provided to them by Iraqi generals that essentially said where all the troops were. And so just because there were no barracks to report to because they had been bombed away, just because that they weren't all gathering on a street corner saying, hey, we're ready, whenever you want us, didn't mean that it could not have been reconstituted. It was a truly, truly disastrous decision. Both of them were.
Jeffrey, why so little thought to the day after?
I think this is actually something that we're going to continue to ask. I think when historians look back on this period, they're going to have two fundamental questions. And the first, of course, is why the United States went into Iraq. I think there's less of a question about why we went into Afghanistan than there is a secondary question for both countries, which is why we wound up doing it so badly. And I think one of the reasons is, to go back to what I said before, Americans had an expectation that they were going to win, and their military had been so dominant in their prior conflicts, especially the first weeks of Afghanistan, or go back to 1991, that Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and others believed that you could do more with less, that we could do more with technology, that we could essentially destroy the enemy on the battlefield quite easily, and that everything would flow fine after you destroy the enemy, not recognizing that, frankly, as the British learned in 1776 and onward, it's not actually defeat on the battlefield that's hard. It's defeating and occupying a country that's hard. It's essentially eliminating a counterinsurgency that's very hard. And you simply can't do that with a small footprint that we used in both instances, in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So when we look back, I think we're going to, unfortunately, not so much wonder if we could have done it right, what would have happened? But at the very least, ask ourselves, why did we not do it in a way that could have ended well?
If I can cut in just to add that, and this alludes to something that, or discusses something Jeffrey had alluded to before, which was that we were intellectually lazy in assuming that to every question, freedom was the answer. And in Iraq, that look, if we depose Saddam Hussein, and these were actual conversations that intelligent policymakers had, they were of the belief, beginning with President Bush, that if you gave Iraqis an opportunity for freedom, they would coalesce around it. They would forget all of their sectarian problems. They would essentially on the fly become democratic institutionalists. They would quickly and without any jealousies rely on Iraqi exiles who had not seen their country in 30 years, but who did have at least some bureaucratic contact. Freedom would conquer everything.
Well, I think that's a great point that both of you made there. And as that viewer may know, Nikki McCuistion, our producer, and I were in Iraq and Baghdad in particular in 2004. We were there on the 1-year anniversary of the war, frankly, and the people we interviewed in the military, but also civilians, it was obvious to us at the time that things were not going the way they should be. And that's 2004, and we're just, journalists, so to speak. I think in your book, Robert, you mentioned maybe that Rumsfeld and others at one point wrote a memo that said, who's the enemy and what are we trying to do? I mean, this was not something that was new, and we didn't find out about it in 2010, 15, or 16. Am I right?
Well, I mean, the infuriating thing, one of them, about the late Donald Rumsfeld was his proclivity for asking questions that by their very asking made him sound clever, but wouldn't bother to try to answer them himself. And sure, that question was floated frequently. What is the enemy? What do they look like? And but there was Rumsfeld also, much more meaningful, I think, in 2003, basically saying, oh, there's no insurgency. He refused to use the I word, said instead that these are a bunch of dead enders, and that freedom was untidy. So if these questions were being asked even in a semi-serious way, their answers weren't being explored seriously.
We have just another minute, but I'd like to hear from Jeffrey. Why didn't Saddam Hussein just admit earlier that he didn't have WMD and raise the white flag? Or did he think that we would not intervene?
This is actually one of those great moments where I think we actually have an answer. As historians, in that we have a tremendous trove of Iraqi documents from this period. And by and large, Saddam Hussein, of course, did not have weapons of mass destruction, but recognized that much of his power internally came from the thought that he had those weapons, and everyone within his military presumed that he had those weapons. And more importantly, that the reason that they were suffering through years of sanctions was in order to maintain those weapons. If Saddam Hussein suddenly showed up domestically and said, I've been joking this whole time. I don't have these weapons. And more importantly, you've been suffering for something that never existed in the first place. His life expectancy would have been dramatically shortened. So in essence, once he said he had them, he had to keep the bluff up.
Yeah, they did keep the bluff up, and that's very important. We just have, as he said, a minute or so left. But Robert, let me get you to close with the thought about what our foreign policy is looking like and what Afghanistan is likely to look like in the next few years.
Sure. I mean, I do think that slightly contrary to what Jeffrey had said a few minutes ago, I think that the Biden administration or President Biden himself has come to learn the limitations of American military power, and that these creeping commitments can be a sort of a weakening force of their own. There is still a constellation of foreign policy possibilities between the kind of adventurism that took place, unfortunately, in the Iraq War and the kind of isolationism that took place in the Trump administration. This is by way of saying, Dennis, that unfortunately, I don't think we have advanced the ball very much in addressing those baseline questions. What is America's role in the world? When is it in our interest to intervene? And when and how do we get out once we do?
Well, we appreciate both of you joining us. Jim and I have been fascinated by your answers, and I'm sure that viewer is too. We spent $6.5 trillion and countless lives lost in this so-called war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. If we haven't learned anything, then shame on us, because we've been here before. I think there was something called Vietnam, as far as I can tell. If you will continue to watch this program, you can check it on McCuistionTV.com and our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter. I hope that we can keep you up to date with perspectives that are slightly different from what you see in other parts of the media. Jim, thank you for co-hosting as always. Robert, you and Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, because you are the people we do this for. We talk about things that matter with people who care.